Hello, welcome to Philosophy Roulette. This is number 177. Is that right? That is right. 177, where we read and review philosophy live on air for the viewing public and whoever that might be. I got some requests in the last. I took a few days off, more than a few days, but I took a few days off. But I got some requests in the meantime, so I might as well do the requests. Now, one of them showed up on my latest YouTube video, but there's been some shenanigans on YouTube. I don't really trust the YouTube folks. And you know what? Comments aren't showing up, especially comments with links in them, even legitimate links that are sort of like on topic. And I can suspect that what's going on is that on some of them it was let's see, the sort of shenanigans was it was anti-Black Lives Matter shenanigans where people were marking anti sort of white supremacist stuff as spam. So this was anti-racist stuff was being marked as spam, and that's why it didn't show up. But I got a request for this paper in here, A New Argument for Necessary Being by Joshua Rasmussen, who I've also had the pleasure of reading in the past. I think we did 2 of his articles, and I'm going to do a 3rd because there was a request for it. So you can go over to his website, joshualrasmussen.com, and you can click on the link. What is this one called again? This is A New Argument for Necessary Being. It is here. You get it off his webpage, and it pops right up. So I like that. It doesn't take... It's a lot quicker. Oh, no. Oh, no, no, no. Twitch is dropping frames again. Twitch is having lots and lots of difficulties. I hope it's not too bad. I'll have to see. The bitrate is a little slow. But, hey, no big deal. We haven't even started broadcasting yet, so this is kind of weak. But anyway, so let's, don't even have it loaded yet, but it won't take more than a second. So, yeah, I'm also trying to think of new formats and other things I can do with Philosophy Roulette, as it were. So, I don't think I'm going to keep posting twice a day. We are starting to slowly open up in New York, so, which is very cool. We're finally, through a lot of just patience of basically on everyone's part, we're finally starting to open back up. So, which is really cool. So, that means I have other things I need to get done, and also, I mean, I've done 175 of these, I think, total. The episode number is not perfectly corresponding to how many I've done. So, I'm going to have to put together some reflections and then see, and I'm going to keep up just doing what this is, but we'll see if there's anything else that can be done. Okay, A New Argument for Necessary Being by Joshua Rasmussen. Yeah, maybe I should, can't tell on the frames and the bit rate, but hopefully it'll hold up for the course of this. It's only a 7-page paper. Thank you for writing short papers, Joshua Rasmussen. Okay, introduction. I will offer a new argument for the age-old thesis that there is at least one necessary being, that is, a necessary existing entity capable of causal activity. I call the argument the modal argument from beginnings, or just modal. Alright, so we have a modal argument called modal, because it makes use of the premise that any beginning of a certain sort, to be specified, possibly has a cause. Okay, so right from the get-go, what you should be paying attention to here is notion of possibly and necessarily. This is what it is to be the logic of possibility and necessarily. A necessity is if it's not possible, then it is necessarily not. And if it's possibly not, then it is not necessarily. So there's something to do with negation between these two things. And so we're going to have to see about existing entity over here, and then the negation and possibility, or negation and necessity. Okay. So, as we shall see, this premise is unusually modest as far as premises go in arguments for a necessary being. Alright, so we're going to see how modest. Philosophers are not modest. Come on, Josh. You know this. The modal argument from beginnings. Here is the argument. 1. Normally for any intrinsic property P, that 1 can begin to be exemplified, and 2 can be exemplified by something that has a cause, there can be a cause of P's beginning to be exemplified. 2. The property of C of being a contingent concrete particular is an intrinsic property. 3. Property C can begin to be exemplified. 4. Property C can be exemplified by something that has a cause. Alright, so alright, we'll have to see where he's going with this. Alright, therefore, 5. There can be a cause of C's beginning to be exemplified. 6. If 5, then there is a necessary being. Therefore, 7. There is a necessary being. In what follows, I shall first support 1. Second, I will discuss 1's advantages over causal principles used in other cosmological arguments. Thirdly, I will discuss and support the remaining premises. Finally, I shall consider a possible way out. Alright, so 1. I guess this is the big old thing. Normally, for any intrinsic property P that first can begin to be exemplified and secondly can be exemplified by something that has a cause, there can be a cause of P's beginning to be exemplified. Alrighty. Okay, so continuing. 3. The causal principle. Premise 1 says this: any beginning of an exemplification of an intrinsic property can have a cause, so long as the property can have caused instances. Alright, so you have to have instances. That's interesting. If one is worried that an exemplification of a property is not the sort of thing that can be caused, one may replace has a cause with is brought about by the causal activity of something. I'm not worried about that. What I'm worried about is, do we mean exemplification or instantiation here? Because if you're going from beginning of an exemplification, if you just mean an instantiation of an intrinsic property, then can have a cause. So long as the property can be instantiated, then this gets a little bit more circular sounding. So if you're saying instantiation, then you have instances. It's like, well, okay, but I'm not exactly sure. You have to tell me more about what exemplification is there. What is a beginning of an exemplification? To simplify matters, continuing. To simplify matters, I've limited the scope of 1 to intrinsic properties. It is notoriously difficult to give a precise account of intrinsic properties, but for present purposes, we may stipulate the following sufficient condition. 1. P is intrinsic if one... You know what? This is latexified, so there we go. A little zoomed out in the latex printing. 1. P is intrinsic if one who grasps P does not thereby grasp any external involation. Okay. P is intrinsic if one who grasps P does not thereby grasp any external relation. Okay, so it has to be somehow just self-grounding and not external at all. And thereby is interesting. Philosophers may debate possible exceptions, but one suffices to restrict our attention to properties that are less conceptually gerrymandered than extrinsic properties tend to be. Alright, so who knows what an external property is either, though? I don't. Premise 1 is defeasible, hence the normally operator, and so, if you want to grab the paper, you can, it's not on that link, but you have to go to the website, and then it's on his website, so, but, sure. And feel free to ask any questions if you'd like. And I'm sorry if frames are dropping. It's Twitch has been wonky recently. Premise 1 is defeasible and it's the normally operator, and so may be treated as a rule of thumb. That is, for any given property we consider, we have reason to think 1 applies to it unless we have reason to think that the property in question is an exception to the general rule. So, alright, so this is a general rule of thumb that if there's nothing external about it, then it's intrinsic, sort of a negative thing. What evidence might there be to support 1? Perhaps a priori intuition provides support. To see how, first imagine an arbitrary unexemplified intrinsic property I. Suddenly something changes. Snap. Property I becomes exemplified. At this point you may wonder why I suddenly became exemplified. Your mind might thus be inclined to think that I's exemplification can have a causal explanation if I can have causal instances. I suspect that some philosophers who come to the table as skeptics of a necessary being will have this intuition. Okay, just let it go. Continuing, we might also support one abductively by considering cases in which beginnings of the relevant sort can have causes. For example, when a scientist creates a new piece of technology, a new type of thing begins to exist, and the scientist thereby causes one or more intrinsic properties to begin to be exemplified. As another example, we might imagine hydrogen and oxygen atoms coming together to form the first molecule of water, thereby causing the property of being water to become exemplified. In general, when we consider a new type of object, we can coherently imagine a cause of the exemplification of the new intrinsic properties instantiated by that object. Thus, we might infer one as a plausible explanation of these cases of apparent causability. If someone has reason to doubt one based on certain exceptional cases, she could still accept one as a general rule of thumb. I mean, I'll grant it for the course of paper. I'm just worried that this is a negative sort of argument, does not thereby grasp external relations. So you're not showing what it is, you're showing what it is not. And so it's sort of a negative on the external relations. And so that does seem, it's a fine sort of rule of thumb because it is very weak. It's just negative, not any of those things. But I'm not sure I still know what these things are. It's just only in the negative. Let's see. Yeah, and my general problem with the world is I have no intuitions that match up with anybody else's anymore. So, like this sort of like stuff, you might think this. It's like, no, I don't. All right, but so something showed up, and you might think it has a causal explanation, and that's part of your intuition. Me, I don't have intuitions like that. All right, advantages. Graham Oppie in 2009 has recently argued that cosmological arguments of every kind make use of principles that are not evident to those who don't already accept the conclusion of such arguments. Oppie's main criticism is this: there is no reason that is both evident and neutral to think that something is responsible for the existence of the totality, the causal chain, or the beginning of natural objects. Modal sidesteps Oppie's criticism because its causal principle allows for the possibility of uncaused natural objects. The conclusion of modal is that there is a causally capable necessary being, not that a necessary being was actually the cause of the totality, causal chain, or beginning of natural objects. Therefore, modal has an advantage over the cosmological arguments Oppie criticizes. The causal principle of modal also has the advantage of being more modest than other causal or explanatory principles used in arguments for a necessary being. Three of the most modest causal or explanatory principles in the literature are as follows. GP. For all x is a contingent fact implies that diamond, possibly, that x has an explanation. So it looks like so if there's something contingent, then it possibly has an explanation. So it's not even a principle of sufficient reason, it's just possible sufficient reason. Then we got K. Normally, for all things, X is a contingent fact, then X has a cause. So there's sufficient reason. Where wholly contingent fact is a fact which contains only contingent concrete objects. That's okay, Carnatus. If you have like questions, I'll try to answer it. What this person looks like they're trying to do here is they're trying to prove that this is a cosmological argument. I mean, they come down from history saying, basically trying to prove God exists. Normally people of course still try to prove God exists using logic. I mean, who knows if that's a good idea, if that's how you actually learn anything about God. But this is just trying to do a bit more of this is a very modest claim, as the author has said. We're not trying to actually prove God exists. We're just trying to prove that something exists, necessarily, though. So it's not that we're proving like God necessarily exists, but that something has to possibly exist. And so how do you prove out of nothing that something has to possibly exist? Or possibly needs to be. So here's the big old conclusion right here. Therefore, there is a necessary being. And I mean, in the past, this was God, but I mean, that's not implied here. This is just an argument that there is a necessary being. And so the person here is saying, look, if something comes to be is exemplified in a certain way, then because it could even possibly be that way, then there has to be something that could at least possibly be that way. But that's basically, I think, what's going on here. So if something can start to show up, then something has happened. and then therefore something must have happened. Alright, so where were we? Okay, so we try. Thank you, Carnitas. So let's see. Normally, what was I saying? Okay, so this is a principle of sufficient reason where a wholly contingent fact is a fact which contains only contingent concrete objects. So there's something completely just in the world. It's contingent, like it is 85 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 30 for you in your centigrade. It's not comfortable in New York because it is humid. But yeah, so that's a contingent thing. So if this is a wholly contingent fact, and then that means it has a cause because that's how the weather is going here in New York. All right, so here's another one. R. For all things, X is a type of contingent concrete object, then possibly the fact that there is at least one member of X is causally explained. All right, so it says, look, there's even if it's not a fully it's like one type of thing that might happen, like the weather, then there's at least one thing in that has a causal, like why is it so humid? Well, we have a causal explanation for the humidity. All right, consider each in turn. GP applies to contingent facts in general, whereas 1 is concerned with a limited category of contingent facts about beginnings. Therefore, 1 is more modest than GP. 1 is also more modest than K because 1 entails that certain wholly contingent facts about beginnings, are possibly caused to obtain, where K entails that every wholly contingent fact is actually caused to obtain. Yeah, K seems a little strong that everything in a contingent fact needs to be explained. And finally, 1 is more modest than R because 1 applies only to types or properties that can begin to be exemplified, whereas R applies to types that cannot begin to be exemplified, for example, being eternal. Okay, so again, this is saying the idea that something can be beginning is all that you need to show that something necessarily exists. All right. In sum, 1 has the following advantages over the previous causal principles. It is I is more modest than them, and 2 can be used in cosmological arguments that dodges Oppie's criticism. Okay, the rest of the premises. Let's now discuss the rest of the premises. First, recall 2, which says that the property C of being contingent, concrete, particular is intrinsic. Property C seems to satisfy 1, the stipulated condition for being intrinsic, because we can evidently grasp C without thereby having to grasp some external relation. Therefore, we may regard C as intrinsic. Yeah, so I think this is just saying the concept of beginning, because we have defined it as such, that's not external to anything. It's just that it did start, and so it has a starting thing, and that's not related to anything else, so we're going to call that intrinsic. Premise 3 says that C can be exemplified. This is equivalent to the claim that there can be a beginning to the existence of all contingent concrete particulars. Alright, so what did I get wrong here? Okay, so yeah, so that it can begin to be, it is intrinsic, and then it can do this. This is equivalent to the claim that there can be a beginning to the existence of all contingent concrete particulars. For example, we can imagine a beginning to the existence of contingent bits of matter as they explode out of an initial singularity. Or we can just say, look, it's humid today in New York. It is. Premise 3 does not assert that this is actually the case, only that it is broadly logically possible for this to be the case. I take this to be a fairly modest premise as far as non-causal premises go in cosmological arguments, and I suspect that many skeptics of a necessary being will accept it. I have no idea what skeptics actually think anymore. Can begin to be exemplified. I have a lot of worry about what it means to be exemplified, but let's keep going. Premise 4 states that there can be a contingent concrete particular that has a cause. Take me, for example. I am a contingent concrete particular, and my existence was caused some time ago. If someone thinks that there are no contingent things, then the conclusion of the argument can be reached even more swiftly. Some things have causal capacities. 2, no things are contingent. Therefore, 3, there is a necessary being. Yeah, well, if no contingent things, then there are only necessary things, and so if anything exists, then it's necessary. Yeah, that makes sense. It follows from 2, 3, and 4 that C is a sort of property to which 1 applies because C has the following features. It's intrinsic, it can begin to be exemplified, and it can have caused instances. Thus, 1 implies that C can be caused to become exemplified. Let's call this the beginning of C's exemplification, a beginning of contingency. From 1 to 4, it follows that 5, there can be a cause of a beginning of contingency. Alright, so at some point, it started getting humid. And it's disgusting in New York. Alright, let's turn finally to 6. If 5, then a necessary being exists. To see why 6 is true, consider the following reasoning. Suppose that there is no necessary being. 2 claims follow. First, it is not possible for a necessary being to cause a beginning of contingency. It is not possible for a necessary being to cause a beginning of contingency. This is because if there is no necessary being, then it is not possible for there to be a necessary being. Assuming the modal axiom S5. Once you have no necessary being, then it can't poof into existence, because then it would be contingent. That's the definition of that sort of thing. Second, it is not possible for contingent concrete particular to cause a beginning of contingency without circularity. This is because C, the property of beginning a contingent concrete particular would already have to be exemplified if a contingent concrete particular were to cause C to begin to be exemplified in the first place. In other words, the exemplification of contingency would be prior to the exemplification of contingency, which is impossible. Yeah, so if it caused itself, then it already had to exist, and you can do an infinite regress all the way back to whenever. And that would make it necessary, because it would go on infinitely in both directions. It caused itself in the past, and it caused itself in the future, and that would continue to cause whatever happened, and so that would make it a necessary being all the way through. Thus, if there is no necessary being, then it is not possible for anything to cause a beginning of contingency, which contradicts 5. Therefore, if there is no necessary being, then 5 is not true. This result is the contrapositive of 6. Therefore, 6 is true. From 1 to 6, it follows that there is a necessary being. Alright, a way out. I mean, I know my way out. Let's see what Mr. Joshua Rasmussen's way out is. Naturalists will think that for every possible causal series of contingent things, one of the following holds. Naturalists. I don't know who they are, but okay. 1. The series is initiated by one or more uncaused contingent things. 2. The series regresses infinitely. Or 3. The series is initiated by one or more necessary beings, either natural objects. Okay, so we have no God here. See, this is, I think, where we're coming from the history. The naturalist wants there only to be contingent things in the world. Given that 3 is consistent with the conclusion of modal is strictly compatible with naturalism. As long as it's initiated by necessary beings, that's fine. But some naturalists may reject a 3 on the grounds that the concrete things must be spatial and that no spatial thing exists in every possible world. How might such a naturalist respond to modal? The most promising response I see is to offer a reason to think that while 1 is a good rule of thumb, it does not apply to a beginning of contingency. We might reason in the following way. We see that if 1 did apply to a beginning of contingency, then there could be a causal series initiated by a necessary being, which would imply that a necessary being exists. But we have reason not to accept the existence of a necessary being, therefore we have reason to think that 1 does not apply to a beginning of contingency. Okay. That is a good rule of... Okay, so this is going back to the rule of thumb, saying the negative, saying if... let's go back to 1 real fast. So even though 1 is a good rule of thumb, it's not good enough. Alright, so... Yeah, so that means it can begin to be exemplified, then it has a cause. Because if it can begin to be exemplified, then something caused that beginning. Alright. Alright, so if something can begin to be exemplified, then something caused that beginning, but maybe the beginning itself is not what the thing caused. Maybe it just sort of caused the whole chain past the beginning. But the beginning itself is something different. We might reason the following way. We see if that 1 did apply to a beginning of contingency, then there could be a causal series initiated by a necessary being, which would imply that a necessary being exists. But we have reason not to accept the existence of a necessary being. Therefore, we have reason to think that 1 does not apply to the beginning of contingency. So this is sort of cutting the head off the snake, or the tail off, whatever you want. But like the rest of the snake sort of happened, but you just don't know what happened in the beginning. So like the Big Bang is sort of uncaused somehow. Although the above reply may be perfectly rational, I have 3 reasons for thinking modal is still valuable. First, the way out I suggested presupposes that one actually has reasons not to accept a necessary being. Alright, so this is saying, like, do you have a reason to say that it doesn't exist, that beginnings are uncaused? If one is initially agnostic about necessary being but finds one plausible, then modal could incline one to a new belief. One could come to think there is a necessary being. Second, I don't believe it is legitimate to make an exception for a beginning of contingency unless one's reasons for not accepting a necessary being are at least as strong as one's total evidential support for one. Alright, so I mean, it's like, why it is calling that ad hoc. Why would you say the first thing that happened was uncaused? That's crazy, because that's just ad hoc. You're just making stuff up. So it's sort of like, what's your reasons for that? And if it's ad hoc, then you're reasoning sort of badly at that point. You should take this sort of reasoning as evidence for itself. Alright, for if one's total support for one is weightier than one's reasons for not accepting a necessary being, then one would have to have a defeater for the belief that there is no necessary being. Thus, although someone might conjoin naturalism with the belief that natural objects are contingent to defeat one, someone else could instead come to see that one as a defeater for the conjunction of naturalism and the belief that natural objects are contingent. Yeah, so it's like, depending what your biases are, they're just going to show up here. So everything hangs on how plausible one seems. Finally, if we view the rejection of a necessary being as a defeater for one, then I think we would have still learned something interesting. We will have learned that not all beginnings of the sort discussed, those consisting of the exemplification of intrinsic properties that can have caused instances, can have a cause. And this all men call progress. Okay. So in the end, we just end up with progress. What's footnote 15 then? I'm grateful to have... Okay, they're just thank yous. Okie dokie, what to say about this? If there's any questions out there, I will try to answer them. Right, so back to my big criticism of this sort of stuff is that this is using logic to try to prove the existence of a necessary being. This is arguing logically. You will notice that, where was it? There was an explicit reference to S5, which is the modal logic of, I guess, favored by the author here. Assuming modal axiom S5. This is sort of the thing that's going on. We're assuming a kind of logic. And let's see, it was footnote 13 before I say something stupid. See if it was covered. Blah, blah, blah. No, there's not what I'm going to say. Okay. So, I mean, this is using a certain understanding of logic. And a certain understanding of logic has more philosophy built into it than people usually understand. They think the logic is some sort of, in the grand scheme of the universe, the metaphysics is here, but the logic is here, because you still have to use logic to understand the metaphysics. The metaphysics somehow is some sort of space between the logic and, like, the real world. And so, whatever is metaphysically the case, like, if there happens to be a necessary being, it still relies on the logic to get there. This is very dangerous for someone like me, because I've lost most of my intuitions about logic, and so even in the logic there's assumptions that are being made. Most importantly, when you instantiate, what is it to be instantiated? And this goes back to the very first thing I said. Premise 1 says this: any beginning of an exemplification of an intrinsic property can have a cause, so long as the property can have been caused instances. What is it to have an instance? Is this an instantiation? And what is the assumed with instantiation in logic? It's usually a lot of times it's one of these backwardsy things, and this is called the existential operator because it has existential import. It means there's existing, this thing exists. That's what the backward Z does. It's an existential quantifier, and it says something about the existence of something. And so I always worry about these sorts of things when you're not specifically spelling out what you mean by the logic, that you're pulling in some sort of existential claim from the logic in the form of the backwards E operator. You do not actually have to use this operator, but then of course you're not using the standard logics. But why is this logic the way it is standard? That's historically contingent. We don't need to do that anymore. So you can just call this the sum operator. So some things like this, but that doesn't mean they exist. And so this very much worries me when you're talking about instances and exemplification. So it's like there exists something that has a property. So the intrinsic property. So because this is quantification logic, these are talking about like properties. So there exists P property X. So this is like sort of like what these sort of formulas look like, but it is the property. So this sort of thing says something has this property, and that thing kind of exists. So this is what worries me. What exactly is the relationship between exemplification and instances? Is an instance just an instantiation of a property, but then are you pulling in this existential import here from the existential force from the existential operator? Okay, and so again, that's the base thing there. And so there's a problem also in the logic called the adoption problem. You can't escape the logic sometimes. And so that also is an issue. Why is the logic set up the way it is? And there are things that are unescapable. You just can't get out of it. No one knows how. It's a problem. If you can solve the adoption problem, you'll become famous in the very, very narrow world of philosophical logic people. But like it will be important to them. Yeah, so, and that's a related problem, basically stating you can't get out of instantiation. You always need to be able to have instantiation. We can't talk to each other without actually instantiating individuals or being able to talk about that. And so that also is an issue going on here, why I think this is an important question to answer. Okay, then of course, we've got beginnings and things like that are going on here, which is cool. We can talk about beginnings and possibilities. So if something possibly begins, then something possibly has to have caused that beginning. So that's the question about what is a sort of thing that can be caused. And as the author was arguing here down at the bottom, how would we even know anything about that? Like, why would we have intuitions about understanding about what causes things? All the times we've ever had any issues about what exists in the world, it's always usually been with a principle of sufficient reason. You can always go back and find some sort of cause for everything that is contingent in our world. And so the idea that there is the world itself has no beginning, in some sense, would be a break from that sort of history. And so basically it comes down to what your prior understandings are here. And I said, look, even if you don't, whichever way you fall, then you will understand that this is the debate here, that how you understand this sort of stuff matters. This also goes to the understanding of possibly and necessarily. So if do you think there's a necessary being like God or just something non-contingent that started the universe, then what exactly does that hold? Like how far? Yeah, how far does our understanding of our logic and the concept of necessity actually go? I don't know. I mean, we use it in our logic this way, but who's to say this is the logic of the universe? This is just the best we can do at the moment. And the best we can do at the moment is very impressive, but the best we can do at the moment may not be very good. I'm a bit of a cynic. I'm not a skeptic, I'm a cynic. I don't think we're very clever. We like to think we are. I don't think we are. So I'm less fussy about saying that. So what if you're saying necessarily exist? I don't even that has less force for me. So the necessity there, or possibly, I'm not sure of the actual relation between these concepts. And so the idea that you can argue from not possibly to necessarily, maybe, but no, I sound like Kripke. But yeah, so it's I'm not so I'm just worried about the force we're pushing on the logic here, because we're pushing the logic into the metaphysics, or the metaphysics into the logic. And so this is a modal argument for the necessity of things, but I'm worried we're conflating the notions of some logical notions and metaphysical notions that we got to be more, that I'm not clear on. And so I'm just worried about that sort of thing in general. All right, all of that is not to say this is a bad article. This is an excellent article because, well, it is. This is a hard article to make. As mentioned in the first line, this is an age-old argument saying anything new about this is very difficult, and the concept of the argument of strategy here, where you're tracking everything back to beginnings, is, as far as I know, and I guess this argument from beginnings is new. So if this is the first time anyone could have argued for this in the last 2,000 years of Western philosophy, I don't know about the rest of us, the rest of the philosophies, but if this is the first time this happened, that's very impressive. And so the question is, what do we actually understand of the meaning of beginnings then? Yeah, so this is you're going all the way back, and I can see that the angle of the sun. I don't normally broadcast at this time of day, but I'm getting the sunlight in my face because I'm in front of a window. So I apologize if I look a little funky, but this is the question: what does it mean to track something back to the beginning? So this sort of concept needs to be investigated too if we really want to accept the conclusion. So what is it to begin anything? We don't know, and that's sort of also a bit of a worry here, but it's a very interesting way to go about this. And so if you're going to do something interesting like this, if you're going to try and make up a new argument from 2,000 years of Western philosophy, and you come up with something as simple as a beginnings argument, kudos to you. Okay, so unless the chat has anything else to say, that'll be it for now. I got one other suggested article. I'll take a look at that, see if it's actually, I didn't even see if that one was suitable. If it's too long, it's no good, but we'll see, because they said it was more of a it was more designed to be a little bit more public facing and not for just the navel gazing academics papers that I typically read. So we'll see, but okay, that's it for now, and I hope everyone has a good day and stay safe out there, and I will be back soon, hopefully. All right, bye-bye.